Hello. I'm glad you made it here tonight.
In a moment, I'll share a story with you, one meant for your sleep. This story is made to be heard with your eyes closed, because while you sleep, it goes straight into your subconscious. She is calm but powerful. She will change the way you see the world. It will plant new seeds in your mind, ideas of prosperity.
So lie down there, snuggle up, relax.
Because the balloon is going up now, and history will take you with it.
Sometimes, luck doesn't come running. It walks slowly and wears the disguise of failure. Not everything that turns out right starts right, and some ideas only bloom after hope has already left. Today, during the day, I thought a lot about this story I'm about to tell you. It's not a story that begins with a big moment. It begins with a blank notebook and 3 failed attempts. But since we're still here and you haven't fallen asleep on me yet, go ahead and leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. And if your mind is still buzzing, okay? Tell me in the comments what happened in your day that made it worth it, even if it was something small. Think about it and share it with me. I'll read and reply to every single one. I promise. Well, the story begins in the silence of someone who had already given up and yet kept creating. So if you, too, feel like you're carrying dreams no one else can see, get comfortable. Close your eyes and just listen, because maybe this story is closer to yours than you realize. And maybe what you're holding in your hands today feels small, but it might be exactly what the world has been waiting to discover. He had already failed 3 times, 3 attempts, 3 ideas that went nowhere, 3 beginnings that ended halfway through, like doors that shut softly but inside left an echo. The first failure came when he believed too much, the second when he doubted, the third when he felt nothing at all. And now, sitting in a small workshop surrounded by worthless papers and worn-out pencils, he wondered if there was still any idea left in him that mattered. The hum of a broken fan spun slowly, keeping company with the emptiness. Outside, the sun was setting, as if to say, maybe tomorrow. But he didn't care much for tomorrow anymore. He just wanted to understand why everything seemed to go wrong. Even when he tried to do everything right, people used to say he was too creative for such a practical world. Others said he should stop dreaming and get a real job. But what no one saw was what he put into those drawings. They weren't doodles. They were maps. Invisible maps of something. He still couldn't explain. He tried selling his first projects to small companies. He heard promises, empty compliments, a few fake smiles, and politely closed doors. Over time, he learned to smile before the disappointment arrived. It was a way to brace his chest, but that gray afternoon, holding a crumpled paper with an unintentional sketch, something inside him went quiet. It wasn't discouragement. It was another kind of silence, the kind that comes when the mind stops screaming and starts listening. It was just a line, curved, simple, almost childish, but he looked at it and thought, maybe I've drawn something I don't yet understand. Time seemed to pause, as if the drawing were a whisper from the future, and for the first time since the 3 failures, he didn't try to understand, he just accepted that something was there. The next morning, he folded that paper and tucked it into his pocket, not because he thought someone would buy it, but because, in some quiet way, he knew that line was the beginning of something. He left home with empty pockets, but that folded drawing, as if it were an old secret. There was no clear destination, just the desire to walk, and sometimes, when everything feels uncertain, walking is enough. The morning breeze felt lighter than usual. Maybe the world hadn't changed, but his gaze had. And when the gaze changes, the world slowly obeys. He stopped in front of a small cafe with foggy windows and the smell of fresh bread leaking through the cracks. He ordered only a coffee, and when he pulled out the paper to sketch absent-mindedly, the cashier glanced at it, curious. "Do you draw?" the young man asked, tired eyes but alert. He just smiled. It wasn't a yes or no anymore, just a quiet gesture. The young man asked to see, and when he looked at the drawing, his brows furrowed, then relaxed. Then he looked again and said nothing. He simply turned, went to a door in the back, and returned with a woman with white hair and eyes far too bright for a colorless city. She wasn't an artist, she was a collector, but not of objects, of meanings. "May I touch it?" she asked, and as she held the drawing in her hands, her eyes filled as if the simple lines spoke something she had forgotten. "Where did you see this?" she whispered. He answered honestly, "I didn't see it. I just let it come out." She didn't explain. She didn't try to interpret. She only said, "This drawing is not ordinary. I know. How much do you want for it?" He almost laughed. It sounded like a joke. After all those failed attempts, someone was asking to pay for something he didn't even know had value. I don't know," she replied. "I offer 100,000. The silence that followed wasn't from doubt. It was from astonishment, but also from acceptance, because deep down, he knew. From the moment he saw that line, it didn't belong to his past, but to someone else's future. He said nothing for a few seconds. The number echoed inside, like a slow-motion wave. 100,000 for a single line, a line drawn during a gray afternoon when he had already given up trying. But the woman didn't look at the paper like art. She looked at it like a mirror. "This line," she said, "reminds me of something I used to dream when I was a child." And then she gently touched the paper, as if afraid to erase what lived there. He took a deep breath, thought about saying no, thought about asking for more, thought about running away. But in that instant, he understood this wasn't about money, never was. It was about value, the value something gains when it touches what's been hidden inside someone. He accepted, not for the amount, but because he felt the drawing was going where it belonged. And that same day, walking out of the cafe with a thin envelope and eyes still in disbelief, he didn't rush to buy anything. No car, no house, no new clothes. He simply walked to the nearest park bench and sat down. The world outside was the same, but inside, something had started breathing again. It wasn't the money, it was the silent confirmation that something inside him had worth. Even if the world hadn't seen it, even if he himself had forgotten. And there, beneath an old tree with leaves falling slowly, as if time were lazy, he pulled out another piece of paper, another forgotten pencil, and he drew again. But this time, not to be accepted, not to sell, not to prove anything. He drew because that's what his soul knew how to do. And maybe, just maybe, that's all it ever wanted. The new drawing was even simpler than the first. No clear intention, no plan to sell it, just soft lines, free curves, as if the paper also wanted to rest alongside him. But strangely, even without thinking of selling, something inside whispered, "This drawing will find someone too." As if the lines carried a secret direction, as if every curve was an invisible compass, pointing toward a heart that hadn't yet seen. The next day, he returned to the cafe. The attendant smiled. The woman wasn't there, but there was a letter waiting for him. No sender, no scent, just a white envelope with a handwritten phrase. "Keep drawing. Some of your lines change other people's." Maps. He didn't know whether to laugh or be moved. Maybe both. It was the first time someone confirmed what he always suspected. That his drawings weren't products, they were messages. But not for the eyes, for the subconscious. In the weeks that followed, he kept drawing, not as an artist, but as a messenger. One drawing left in a bookstore, another pinned beneath a stone in a garden, another hidden inside a returned library book. He left no signature, no contact, no price, just left them and trusted, until one day a soft, trembling voice called out to him in the street, "Are you the one who draws?" He stopped. "I found one of your drawings on a park bench, and it made me cry." "Why?" "'Cause I was about to give up on everything. And that line, it was the same one I used to dream as a child." He didn't know what to say, so he just smiled and said, "Maybe you just remembered what was already yours." From that day forward, he stopped seeking validation, not because he felt complete, but because he understood. What came from his hands was never about him. It was about what it awakened in others. He kept drawing, each line, a seed, each paper left behind, a quiet invitation. People began to meet their own feelings through the drawings. Some cried, others wrote songs, some started painting again, others just smiled for the first time in days. And even though no one knew his name, something strange happened. The drawings started to spread on social media, in galleries he'd never entered, exhibitions where his name didn't appear, but the feeling did. One evening, walking through the city, saw a mural painted on a building. It was the first line. That same one, the simple curve, now enormous, as if the whole world could finally see it. Below it, a phrase, "You don't have to understand what you feel. Just feel." He stood there, watching, told no one it was his, took no picture, shared it with no friend. He just stood in silence. That same silence from the afternoon when it all began. But now, the silence was different. It was peace, and in his pocket, another blank sheet, because he knew. Every time he thought he had failed, it wasn't failure. It was just another line being drawn towards something that hadn't happened yet, and that yet had finally arrived. But in a way he never could have planned, because some forms of wealth can't be bought. They're drawn, and then released into the world. The woman who left notes for the future, and one day found one written back she didn't draw much attention, lived in a small house, painted in aged white, with a gate that creaked every time the wind passed. She was the kind of person who spoke little, but but felt deeply. And maybe because of that, she carried too much inside. Every day after work, she made herself a cup of tea, picked up a notebook page, and wrote, not diaries, notes, short ones, some with dreams, others with quiet gratitude. Sometimes she'd write, "You deserve more than you think," or "Everything will be okay," or even, "If you found this note, maybe you're ready to believe again." But she didn't keep them. She spread them behind books in public libraries, inside old mailboxes, between the flowers in the town garden, tucked between tossed newspapers on bus benches, like someone planting silent seeds without expecting to harvest. Doing this was her way of still believing, even when things didn't make sense, even when no one noticed her. It was like whispering to the universe, "I still believe in goodness." She never expected replies. She knew notes were like seeds, you release them and trust. But on that quiet Thursday morning, when she opened her door, something unexpected happened. A folded piece of paper, no envelope, no name. She recognized the color from afar. It was the same kind of paper she always used, but she hadn't written it, and in the center, in bold, steady handwriting, it said, "Keep going." The woman who left notes for the future. And one day, found one written back. She held the paper as if it were alive, too light to be just paper, too powerful to be just coincidence. Her heart raced, not out of fear, but recognition, as if something she had always believed in had finally spoken back. She looked around. No one on the street, no cameras, no footsteps, just silence, the same silence as every other day. But now it felt like a witness. She walked back inside, sat at her kitchen table, and stared at the note. Keep going, that was all. No signature, no explanation. But in that moment, she understood. Not everything that transforms needs to be explained. Not every form of magic makes noise. Some just reach you, and that's enough. It wasn't a reply, it was confirmation. As if the future itself had whispered, "I heard you." And she cried. Not out of sadness, but that quiet kind of crying that comes when the soul feels held, even when no one else is there. That night, she wrote another note, but this time, her hand was steady. You are not alone. What you plant in silence, time harvests in secret. She placed it inside a book about gardens, on the top shelf of the neighborhood library. Maybe no one would find it. Maybe someone would. But now, she knew that her notes didn't walk alone. They left, and they returned. The woman who left notes for the future, and one day found one written back the days past more gently. Not because life got easier, but because now it's carried a different kind of certainty. It was no longer just hope, it was quiet faith. She kept leaving notes, but now with the sense that someone was reading them. Maybe not with their eyes, maybe not even in this timeline, but someone, somewhere, was reading. One day, she left a note inside an empty box at the bus stop, along with a dried flower. The next day, the flower was gone. In its place, another, alive, more vibrant, more colorful. She smiled without understanding. And maybe that was the point. Some things don't need to be understood. Walking down a quiet street, she saw a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, alone, crying softly, not asking for anything, not even lifting her head. She reached into her coat pocket, wrote on the spot with a blue pen she always carried, Maybe you don't know it now, but this moment will become strength. She folded the note, placed it gently on the ground beside the woman, and kept walking. She didn't look back. She didn't expect a thank you, because she knew the notes don't have to return through hands. They return through the heart. That night, she dreamed of a box full of letters, all written in different handwriting, as if the whole world was beginning to respond. And when she woke, one soft thought remained. The future listens to those who speak with kindness. The following week, she found something different at her doorstep. It wasn't a note. It was a small cardboard box tied with twine inside. Several loose papers, each one held a phrase. Phrases she had written but on notes she had left. Out in the world, someone had been collecting them, keeping them, and sending them back. Beneath all the papers, there was one final sheet written in different handwriting, steady and subtle. The world needs those who write what others are afraid to say out loud. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, she felt she was exactly where she needed to be, doing what only she could do, even if no one knew, even if there was no applause. That night, she didn't write a note. She wrote a letter, but didn't sign it, didn't seal it, didn't mail it. She simply read it softly to herself, and when she finished, she smiled with tearful eyes, because now she knew the words you leave in the world one day return as invisible embraces, and sometimes in the middle of silence. The future writes back. The woman who whispered words to tomorrow she never told anyone, but inside, she carried a longing she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the wish for a better life. It was something quieter, as if there were a seed within her, but no soil. Yet for it to grow, on an ordinary Monday morning, before the sun fully rose, she did something different. She picked up a piece of paper, wrote down 5 short sentences, and read them quietly to herself, so softly. Even the ticking clock in the living room didn't seem to hear. The sentences were simple, but spoken by her. They carried a quiet kind of strength, something between a prayer and a promise. She didn't know why she did it. She just felt she needed to. That night, before going to sleep, she repeated them, not like someone expecting magic, but like someone lighting a candle in a dark room just to remember that light still exists. The next morning, she did it again and again. That night, no skipping, no rushing. She told no one. She didn't mark the days. She didn't wait for anything. She just wanted to keep that little ritual alive, like watering a flower that hadn't bloomed yet. And curiously, the world around her stayed the same. But she started noticing small things, the color of leaves, the sound of her own laughter, slowly returning, and a soft feeling that something was changing even if nothing looked different yet. On the 11th day, she woke up tired. She hadn't slept well. Her mind was full bills, obligations, invisible noise. For a moment, she thought of skipping the words. But as she looked in the mirror, her own eyes seemed to say, "Don't stop now." So she repeated them, more slowly, more intentionally, as if each word had to travel through a fog inside her to finally reach the heart. That night, she whispered the words again, with less strength, but the same intention. The next day, the sun felt brighter, or maybe she just looked at it more gently. Even the breeze seemed to carry something kind, And when she spoke the words, something deep within her seemed to answer even in silence. Days passed. She wasn't counting anymore. But inside her, something was keeping track. A quiet strength, and a softness too. A calm she hadn't known in years. On the 21st day, she woke up before the alarm, made tea, opened the window, and found herself smiling. Before saying a single word, she whispered the 5 sentences, eyes closed, and for the first time, she didn't just believe, she knew. That night, she slept without weight and dreamed of something strange and beautiful. A blank page with a single point of light in the center, as if something was ready to be born but waiting for her. The next morning, something felt different. She didn't just say the words. She received something while speaking them. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a vision. It was more like an idea gently settling inside her, as if it had always been there, just waiting for her to grow quiet enough to hear it. It was simple but clear, an idea that combined what she loved to do with what the world might need. She didn't jump up in excitement. She didn't write out a plan. She simply stayed in her seat a little longer, like someone listening to the last note of a song before standing. In the days that followed, she began to sketch, a little here, a little there. She searched for materials, played with names, tested things quietly. She told no one. She didn't rush. It was like caring for a plant that hadn't yet broken through the soil, but she could already smell the earth warming. The 5 phrases. She kept saying them, now with more softness, almost like sharing a secret, as if the words had walked beside her while she was still unsure. And little by little, pieces started to fall into place, not with fireworks, but gently, like a river finding its path between the stones. 5 months later, her life looked different, but nothing had changed overnight. Everything arrived, slowly, as if life were gently asking permission before offering more. The idea that had quietly arrived on the 22nd day had become something real. At first, small, then with shape, color, and people. And before she even noticed, it began to grow. It wasn't fame. It wasn't a miracle. It was a different kind of wealth. Silent, steady, like roots no one sees but that hold everything together. People she never expected began to reach out. Her handmade creations, filled with soul, started to spread, and curiously, everyone said the same thing. There's something about your work. It feels like healing. She only smiled. She knew that what she had built hadn't come only from her hands. It had come from words. Words she once whispered when no one was watching, when everything still felt uncertain, when she didn't yet believe, but chose to speak. Anyway, today, she still repeats the 5 phrases every morning, not out of fear, but from gratitude for the version of herself that stayed consistent, even when she couldn't see the path, because sometimes life just needs an open door. A sentence, spoken with heart, 21 days of quiet trust, so that on the 22nd day, a new story can begin. And in the end, she understood. It wasn't magic. It was whispered consistency, rooted in faith. The child who only played at being a millionaire, she didn't have much. No new clothes, no fancy toys, not even space in her room, which she shared with 2 sisters, a worn-out shelf, and a fan that made more noise than wind. But she had something. something no one could quite name, something she simply called my favorite game. Every afternoon, when the sun passed through the cracks of the front gate and drew golden lines across the floor, she opened a cardboard box, grabbed scattered sheets, bottle caps, fake coins, and began. Today, I'm selling my luxury hotel. Tomorrow, I have a meeting with the city's owners. I need to sign this contract with this rock right here. People didn't mock her. Some found it cute. Others said, "Poor thing, such a wild imagination. She's too creative for this world." But she didn't mind. She was too busy pretending the broken stairs were her penthouse elevator, or that the living room rug was a helicopter landing pad. When someone asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she answered, "Rich." But not out of greed, out of joy, as if she were saying, rich in ideas, rich in things that don't exist yet, and every single day without fail. But that made far too much sense to be called just pretend, and the strangest part was, without realizing, she was already writing her future line by line. Game by game, she grew up among tight budgets and words like "we can't," "maybe someday," and "that's too expensive." But still, when she was alone, the world changed color. In the neighbor's backyard, she saw land for construction. In the rainwater, she saw hotel pools. In the tree's shadow, a meeting room full of invisible people clapping for her ideas. She wrote with broken pencils on scraps of paper bags, business plans, pretend for sale signs, business cards made from laundry detergent boxes. One time, she wrote, "One day, my ideas will pay for my life." And she buried that note inside an empty ice cream tub, like planting a seed. No one saw, just her, and maybe the universe. Years passed. School came, chores, bills, but every now and then, she still played, quietly now, in notebook margins, in her mind while staring out the bus window. She never stopped, completely, because even without knowing it, she had been training, speaking a language only she understood a language. The world would later call creation. Some rehearse lines. She was rehearsing futures, years later. Now an adult, she lived alone, in a small apartment, worked too much, earned too little, and some days, hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But something had stayed inside a shoebox, tucked high in her closet, were all the old papers from childhood, doodled contracts, hotel sketches, notebook pages filled with invented numbers. One evening, after a long and ordinary day, she found the box by accident, or maybe not by accident, reading those scraps again. She smiled with a feeling both old and new, because it was as if that little girl still lived there, waiting for her to remember. You already knew the path. You just stopped walking. That same night, before going to bed, she opened a new notebook, wrote down a business name, then a service she could offer, then a simple product she knew how to create. At first, she felt silly. It felt like play again, but something inside her answered clearly, "Yes, keep playing, but this time, for real." And that's how it started. Small, quiet, no big funding, but with the same imagination she once used to build towers from cushioned sand host investor meetings with her cats. Only now, her hands were big enough to bring it all to life. 5 months later, she had clients, orders, ideas turning into income. But more than that, she had found her way back to what had always been hers. Her childhood wasn't poor, and now what once seemed like pretend was a project. What was once a dream was now on her calendar. What was once play was now profit. But the most beautiful part was that she never stopped playing. The difference was, now the world was playing along. People saw something special in what she created. They said it had soul. And she knew why, because all of it was born from afternoons spent using twigs as microphones and tree leaves as $100 bills. That child never wanted to be rich just to have. She wanted to be, so she could create. And now she created every day, and with every new idea, with every new customer, she smiled quietly and whispered to herself, "I'm still playing, but now the world pays me for it." And inside that old shoebox, she still kept the note, "My ideas will pay for my life." She had no idea that crumpled piece of paper would become a soft prophecy, one of those that only comes true when you never stop playing with faith. She was already past 60, white hair, steady hands, calm eyes. From the outside, she looked like any ordinary older woman, the kind who carries grocery bags and stories at the same time. But inside, she knew it was never too late. It had only been quiet until now, for many years. She lived like most people, worked to pay bills, did what needed to be done, tucked away small dreams in large drawers, and many times believed that everything she could have lived had already passed. But one day, somewhere between a cup of tea and the sound of rain on the window, something changed. It wasn't a revelation, nor a miracle. It was just a question. What if I still can? That thought didn't come from the world outside. It came from within, from the part of her that had never truly given up, just waited patiently for the right season. She didn't know where to begin. She only knew she didn't want to end this way, not with regrets, not with the feeling that she hadn't tried enough for herself. So, on a quiet Sunday, she opened an old notebook and started listing all the things she knew how to do. Simple things: care, cook, comfort, organize, tell stories. And as she wrote, something stirred in her chest, a quiet spark, like she had just unlocked a door inside herself. In the days that followed, she returned to that notebook. She wrote down memories that seemed small, but carried a kind of wisdom that no book ever taught. She noted old recipes, phrases she used to say to her children, tips she applied every day that no one had ever valued before. But now, she valued them because she realized everything she knew was raw material. It just needed to be shaped. She didn't have a modern computer, no followers, no money to invest, but she had time. And for the first time, she had a will to live for herself. She started by selling simple cakes in her neighborhood, but with a detail. Each package came with a small, handwritten note, a sentence that somehow said exactly what the buyer needed to hear. Soon, the cakes became keepsakes. Then, the orders grew, and someone asked, "Why don't you teach this?" She laughed, but that night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking, maybe that was it. Teach what she lived, live what she always knew. The next week, she created a small phone group named Wisdom of the Day, and began sending short voice notes, brief phrases, real stories, little doses of care that only someone who's lived long enough knows how to give. And without knowing how, in just a few months, people began to pay to listen, to learn, to remember. She didn't advertise, didn't know how to edit videos, didn't consider herself an influencer, but without realizing, she influenced. Younger people said they listened to her audios before bed. Others said they began to see beauty in simple things just because she reminded them how to look. One day, a woman wrote to her, "What you said yesterday changed the way I treat my children." And she cried, not out of vanity, but because, for the first time, she felt her story was serving something bigger than herself. Over time, her voice notes became online gatherings, then small talks in local communities, and eventually, by popular request, a book filled with her quotes, simple, but read by many. People called it luck. Others said it was charm, but she knew the truth. It was time lived with awareness and courage to begin. Even after the age most people call the end, because she understood life doesn't stop with gray hair. It blooms when you finally use everything you've lived. Today, she still lives in the same house. Nothing extravagant, but everything feels more alive. She wakes early, drinks the same tea, but with a different gaze. Each morning now feels like a gift, not an obligation. The money came, yes, but it arrived with something else. Meaning, she was invited to interviews. Her audios became a podcast. Her quotes, wall art, and yet, she told everyone, I became wealthy after 60, but not just in my wallet, rich in myself. Once, at an event, someone asked, "Do you regret not starting sooner?" She paused, smiled, and answered, "No, maybe. The world was only ready to hear me now." That night, back at home, she opened the same old notebook, turned to the first blank page, and wrote one final sentence. It's never too late to bloom. The heart decides the season. Then she turned off the light and fell asleep in peace, knowing that what had begun in silence now quietly touched the world. The artist who never had paper, but created an entire world. He had almost nothing, no canvas, no paint, not even a pencil. But every night, before falling asleep, he would draw. He drew with his finger in the air, invisible strokes only he could see. Yet, they felt so real. People said he was just a distracted young man, too much of a dreamer for the real world. But he wasn't distracted. He was practicing. He created castles, gardens, houses full of light, smiling faces, safe streets, thriving markets, all in the air, all invisible, but for him, it already existed. It was like he was building a map, a path only his mind could follow. And every night was a silent rehearsal for what would one day become real. Over time, he began walking the streets as if he lived in another world. The dirt, roads didn't bother him. He saw marble, the blank walls didn't limit him. He saw paintings and glass windows, and even living in a tiny place, he smiled as if he already lived in a palace, not pretending, but with conviction. Every day, he visualized his art being displayed, his ideas being bought, his name being respected. No one else saw it, but he saw it all. And the more he saw, the more he believed. And the more he believed, the more things slowly began to shift. First, a curious glance, then a quiet opportunity, and like that, the invisible started to take shape. One afternoon, while he was drawing in the wind outside a closed shop, a man stopped to watch. He stood there for a while, silent, following the movements of the finger in the air. Then he asked, "What are you doing?" The young man replied softly, "I'm practicing." "Practicing what? If you don't have paper?" "I'm training my mind to see before the world sees." The man laughed, but not mockingly. There was something different about this boy, a calm glow, a confidence without arrogance. He handed over a card and said, "Find me when you have something visible," and he walked away. But something had shifted in that moment. For the first time, someone had seen, even without seeing. In the days that followed, the artist began drawing on the dirt with sticks, on gray walls with charcoal, in the river sand with dry branches. People walked by and stopped, curious, captivated. His drawings were different. They seemed to carry something beyond form. They carried intention, ideas that touched, images that awakened, memories. Little by little, people started calling him the air artist. The same man who had given him the card returned. He saw a small crowd gathered around a sidewalk drawing, and right there, he made the offer. "I want your first collection, but I haven't kept any of my works." "Yes, you have there right here," he said, pointing to the young man's head and heart. "We just need to put them on paper." And in that moment, the artist, who never had paper, began to write a new chapter, this time in the real world. The carpenter who turned forests into wealth knot. Everyone who plants trees is trying to change the world. Sometimes, they just want to see something grows, something that wasn't there before. That's how his story began. He was a carpenter, not a famous one, not even the best one in his village, but he loved working with wood, because wood carried stories. He believed every piece had lived a life before it reached his hands, and he treated each board, each branch, like an old friend returning home. People came to him when they wanted furniture that would last. He didn't promise speed. The mirror only worked when you believed you were enough. There was once a town where no one truly knew what they looked like. They had mirrors, yes, but none of them showed reflections. The townspeople would glance, adjust their clothes, fix their hair, and walk away, always wondering why the glass stayed blank. In the center of the town stood an old curiosity shop run by a quiet woman named Ilara, soft-spoken, gray-haired, and known for always wearing a deep blue shawl embroidered with tiny stars. Few people noticed that she never tried to sell anything. The shop just existed, as if it were waiting. One day, a young man named Corin walked in. He had just lost his job, again. Not because he wasn't good, but because, deep down, he believed he never was. The moment he stepped inside, the air felt different, as if it wrapped around his thoughts. Ilara didn't ask what he needed. She simply led him to the back of the store, where a single mirror stood, covered in velvet cloth. "This one is different," she whispered. "It only works when you believe you're enough." Corin gave a dry laugh. "So, it'll never work for me." She didn't smile. She just looked into his eyes. "Then, it's time to begin." From that day on, Corin returned to the mirror every evening. At first, nothing changed. The glass remained blank. But Alara gave him a journal and told him to write 5 things he might believe about himself. Not truths, not lies, just possibilities. Maybe I'm more capable than I think. Maybe failure isn't the end. Maybe I'm allowed to dream again. Every night, he would write. Every morning, he would read it aloud before the mirror. The words felt foreign at first, like trying on clothes that didn't fit. But slowly, something shifted. The mirror didn't light up or show fireworks. Instead, one night, a faint outline appeared, barely visible, like fog lifting from a distant hill. Corin blinked. Is that me? Alara nodded gently. Or perhaps the beginning of you. He cried that night, not because of what he saw, but because he realized he hadn't seen anything in himself for years. The mirror didn't lie. It didn't flatter. It reflected back whatever he held inside. So Corin continued. 5 phrases every night. 5 more in the morning, until the mirror stopped showing fog and started showing fire. Not flames, but light. Purpose. A man who hadn't changed overnight, but who had finally begun to believe in what had always been there. He promised soul, and strangely, that was enough for some. But times changed. Factories came. Cheap furniture arrived by trucks, smooth, identical, fast, and man who loved wood was forgotten. He still woke up every morning and opened his small workshop, but now the silence inside was louder. He would sit and run his fingers across empty benches and sometimes wonder, what do I do with hands made to create in a world that no longer asks? One day, while walking near the edge of a dying forest, he noticed something curious. A young tree growing in the wrong season. Out of place, out of time, but alive. He sat beside it for hours. No tools, no rush, just watched. It reminded him of something he'd long forgotten. Growth doesn't follow calendars. It follows intention. So he came back the next day, and the next. He began clearing fallen branches, letting light reach the roots. People laughed. What are you doing? You're not a gardener. But he didn't respond. He just kept returning. 1 tree, then 2. A patch of earth began to breathe again, and something within him did, too. He wasn't planting to sell. He wasn't creating to impress. He was simply honoring life, the silent kind that grows beneath notice. One morning, after months of quiet work, he brought his notebook and wrote a question. What if we treated nature not as a resource, but as a partner? He didn't know it, but that sentence would change everything. The question he had written in his notebook. What if we treated nature not as a resource, but as a partner? Began to follow him like a quiet echo. It whispered through every tree he tended, every soil he touched, every leaf that shivered with new life. Months passed, and his tiny grove began to spread, but not like a normal forest. This one grew dense, fast, balanced. He had unknowingly mirrored a forgotten method of planting, where native species were arranged in a way that mimicked ancient ecosystems. They grew together, protected each other. They didn't compete. They cooperated. One day, a young student noticed a change in the landscape. She was studying environmental restoration. What method are you using? She asked. He blinked. I just watched the trees. and did what made sense. She took photos, wrote an article. That article traveled farther than any of his furniture ever had. Suddenly, scientists and landowners appeared. They wanted to learn, to study, to replicate. But he remained the same, quiet, grounded, still starting. Every day with silence and soil. A foundation reached out, then a university, then a government. He was offered grants, platforms, even awards. But all he ever asked was, will the trees still be safe? They called his technique a revolution. He called it remembering, because he hadn't invented anything. He had simply listened to the earth that had always been speaking. Years later, what began as one forgotten carpenter in a dying patch of land had become a model for global reforestation. Thousands of forests were reborn using his patterns, and one morning, as he sat beside that first young tree, now tall and strong, he whispered, "You were the first to believe in me, before I believed in myself." His wealth did not come in coins. It came in roots, in restoration, in legacy. People often asked how he did it, how he turned a failing craft into a movement, and his answer was always the same. I stopped trying to be useful and started being faithful. So, if tonight you feel your gifts have no place in the world, remember him, the man who saw life where others saw loss, who stopped chasing and started planting, because sometimes wealth doesn't arrive with applause. Sometimes it grows quietly, leaf by leaf, in the places you choose to love. There was once a town where no one truly knew what they looked like. They had mirrors, yes, but none of them showed reflections. The townspeople would glance, adjust their clothes, fix their hair, and walk away, always wondering why the glass stayed blank. In the center of the town stood an old curiosity shop run by a quiet woman named Alara, soft-spoken, gray-haired, and known for always wearing a deep blue shawl embroidered with tiny stars. Few people noticed that she never tried to sell anything. The shop just existed, as if it were waiting. One day, a young man named Corin walked in. He had just lost his job, again. Not because he wasn't good, but because, deep down, he believed he never was. The moment he stepped inside, the air felt different, as if it wrapped around his thoughts. Ilara didn't ask what he needed. She simply led him to the back of the store, where a single mirror stood, covered in velvet cloth. "This one is different," she whispered. "It only works when you believe you're enough." Corin gave a dry laugh. "So, it'll never work for me." She didn't smile. She just looked into his eyes. "Then it's time to begin." From that day on, Corin returned to the mirror every evening. At first, nothing changed. The glass remained blank. But Alara gave him a journal and told him to write 5 things he might believe about himself. Not truths, not lies, just possibilities. Maybe I'm more capable than I think. Maybe failure isn't the end. Maybe I'm allowed to dream again. Every night, he would write. Every morning, he would read it aloud before the mirror. The words felt foreign at first, like trying on clothes that didn't fit. But slowly, something shifted. The mirror didn't light up or show fireworks. Instead, one night, a faint outline appeared, barely visible, like fog lifting from a distant hill. Corin blinked. "Is that Me? Ilara nodded gently. Or perhaps the beginning of you. He cried that night, not because of what he saw, but because he realized he hadn't seen anything in himself for years. The mirror didn't lie. It didn't flatter. It reflected back whatever he held inside. So Corin continued. 5 phrases every night. 5 more in the morning, until the mirror stopped showing fog and started showing fire. Not flames, but light. Purpose. A man who hadn't changed overnight, but who had finally begun to believe in what had always been there. As the weeks passed, Corin began to change in ways no one could explain. Not outwardly. He still wore the same coat, still walked the same streets, but something in his steps had weight now. Not heaviness, but presence. He no longer looked down when speaking to others. He didn't rush to apologize for simply existing. And when he failed, because failure still came, he didn't collapse. He learned. He adjusted. Tried again. One evening, as he stood before the mirror, he noticed something unusual. There was no longer just his reflection. Behind him, in the glass, were faint shapes, like shadows of others. Some curled over with shame, hiding their eyes. Some barely there at all. Ilara, he asked, turning to the woman who always waited in silence. Why are they here? They're not others, she said, her voice like the creak of old pages. They're the versions of you that you buried. The selves you silenced to survive. Corin stared. He wanted to reach for them, but they began to fade. Don't chase them, Ilara whispered. Just welcome them home. So he did, not with grand declarations, but with gentle acceptance. He wrote letters to the child who never felt good enough, Q, to the teenager who masked his fear with laughter, to the adult who sabotaged every opportunity because success felt foreign. And with every letter, the mirror grew clearer, until one day, it didn't just show him, it showed others. People from the town began to visit Ilara's shop. And when they did, something strange happened. The mirror would remain blank until Corin stood beside them. Only then would the fog begin to lift, because he had become something rare, a witness to invisible worth. He didn't speak much. He didn't offer advice. He simply stood, a living reminder that belief was possible, that maybe, just maybe, they too were enough. Years passed. Ilara grew older. Her shawl faded, and one morning she wasn't there. In her place was a note, embroidered with golden thread. The mirror no longer needs me, because the reflection lives in you now. Corin didn't cry. He smiled, and for the first time, he walked through the town without wondering who he was. He knew, not because the mirror told him. The painter who refused to sell colors he didn't believe in there once was a painter who lived at the edge of a quiet village, where the fields were wide and the skies forever open. His house was small, with wooden shutters and a rooftop touched by the golden wind. People passed by without noticing it much, till they saw the window. That window was always glowing, not with light, but with color. Every morning, the painter would open his shutters and hang a canvas, freshly brushed for the world to see. And though the colors changed every day, each one made people stop in silence. His name was not famous. He didn't exhibit in galleries. And yet, people from distant towns began traveling, just to catch a glimpse of his morning canvas. But there was something odd about him. He never sold his paints. People begged. Traders offered him gold. A nobleman once came with a sack full of coins, and every time the painter would shake his head gently and say the same words. I only sell colors that believe in what they touch, and I only sell them when I believe in them. No one quite understood what that meant. Some thought he was mad. Others thought it was arrogance. But the truth was quieter than that. Each color he created was made from something more than pigment. It was made from memory, emotion, and a kind of stillness that words couldn't explain. He walked through forests to collect fallen petals, sat for hours watching the sky shift from blue to dusk, waited for the exact light after rain before mixing, and then he'd sit in silence and listen to the color. Some nights he would discard an entire batch, whispering softly, "Not ready." Other times he'd keep a single drop, cradled like gold. He believed color had intention, that it could carry healing, that it could whisper to walls and awaken the people living behind them. Years passed. The village grew. Modern paints arrived. Stores opened, filled with every color imaginable. But still, every morning, a small group gathered near his home, waiting for that day's canvas to appear. It was not the technique, not the fame, not the novelty. It was the feeling. People said his colors made them feel seen, as if something inside them had been translated into paint. Still, he refused to sell, even when his house began to rot, even when the roof leaked, even when winter came hard and wood was scarce. If a color has no truth, it has no value, he would say. And if it has truth, it cannot be sold like a lie. One evening, a child knocked on his door. She had no shoes. Her coat was too thin, but her eyes were bright. She held up a crumpled paper and said, "I want to paint something, but I don't know which color is real." The painter studied her, then smiled. He walked to his shelves, paused, and pulled out a small jar. Inside was a color no one had ever seen. Not blue, not green, not gold. It shimmered like hope, wrapped in dust. He handed it to her. "This one only works if you believe in what you're painting." She took it and ran. The next morning, the village awoke to a mural at the center square. It was imperfect, messy, childlike, but something about it made people stop. It showed nothing special, just a house, a garden, a sky, but the sky had that color, and somehow it made people cry. No one knew what had changed, but that day something shifted. A merchant offered to buy the color for a fortune, the painter said. No, a company offered a contract to mass produce it. He said no. Instead, he whispered, "If the world wants this color, it must come here to find it. It must learn how to listen to silence, how to wait for the sky, how to believe again." And so they came, not just for the paint, but for the way he taught them to see. Too, as the seasons turned, more people came. They didn't arrive with brushes. They arrived with questions. Why does my life feel gray? Why can't I create anything that feels true? How do I know which color belongs to me? The painter never gave direct answers. Instead, he offered tea, silence, and a chair by the window. And little by little, people began to notice things they hadn't before. The way sunlight touches an old book, the shade of green under wet leaves, the blue that exists only in the eyes of someone who has forgiven themselves. Some returned home with no color, but their eyes looked different. They walked softer, spoke slower, and for the first time in years, they began creating, again not for money, not for approval, but because something had opened inside, and that was all he wanted, to awaken that something. One day, a woman returned older, now, with silver threads in her hair. She had been one of the first to visit him years ago. When her hands trembled too much to paint, now, she held a canvas. It was simple, soft shades of blue and brown. A single candle, flickering. She said, "This is for you." He held it gently, eyes moist, not because of the art, but because of what it meant, that the color had done its job, that it had made someone brave again, that it had lit a fire where only ashes had been. As he hung her painting beside his window, he whispered, "Sometimes the greatest gift is to be unseen, but unforgettable." That night, something rare happened. The village sky turned the same color as the jar he once gave the child, not entirely, but enough for those who believed to notice. People gasped, children pointed, elders smiled, and somewhere inside that glow was permission to create, to begin again, to feel, to hope. The painter, now older, walked through the village and saw colors where he hadn't noticed them before. A red scarf waving in the wind, a yellow door that had always been gray, a child's drawing, left on a bench. It was working, not because he had sold anything, but because he had refused to. He had protected something rare, the truth that cannot be traded, the value that lives in silence, the beauty that doesn't need to be explained to be believed. And in a world that tried to turn everything into product, into profit, he remained a witness, a guardian of invisible things. One morning, the window was empty. The canvas was gone. The jars were closed. The door was locked. People waited. Days passed, then weeks, until finally someone noticed something carved gently into the wooden frame of the window. If you see a color that touches your soul, it's because your soul is ready to be touched. There were no goodbyes, no farewell letters, just that message, and a sky that, every now and then, turned the exact shade of belief. They say the painter never really left, that sometimes traveler sees a man on a hill, holding a brush made of wind, painting on air, and those who see him wake up different the next day. They speak of dreams in color, of paths that weren't there before, of courage that doesn't make noise, but moves mountains, and maybe that's the real legacy. Not the color, not the fame, but the quiet revolution he began. By only painting with what he truly believed in. The mirror only worked when you believed you were enough in a quiet village, surrounded by a forest that always seemed to whisper more than it revealed. There was a story few dared to tell, not because it was dangerous, but because it was unbelievable. At the heart of the forest, there stood a small, moss-covered house, and inside that house was a mirror. No one knew who built it. No one knew how long it had been there. But every few decades, someone would find it, or rather be led to it. They said the mirror was strange. It didn't show your reflection, not at first. Instead, it remained still, fogged, as if waiting. Some called it cursed, others called it holy, but all agreed on one thing: the mirror only worked when you believed you were enough. But how does one believe that? How do you believe in yourself when the world has spent so much time convincing you otherwise? That's where our story begins, with a boy named Elias. He wasn't extraordinary, didn't have a grand destiny, didn't win prizes or light up rooms. He was just Elias, a quiet thinker, an unnoticed helper, someone who always gave, even when he had little. His village was filled with doers and dreamers, farmers, bakers, dancers, weavers, people who seemed to glow. And Elias, he felt like a shadow among stars. One evening, after another day of invisible efforts and silent disappointments, he wandered into the forest. He didn't mean to go far. He just wanted to walk, to escape the feeling of not enough that clung to his skin like damp air. But the forest had plans. Its paths shifted gently beneath his feet. Its trees whispered songs only he could hear. And before long, he found himself at the door of the moss-covered house. He didn't knock, didn't run. He simply stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and wildflowers. Candles lit themselves as he entered, and there, at the end of a narrow hallway, stood the mirror. It was tall, reaching nearly to the ceiling. Its frame was carved with symbols he couldn't read, and the glass, it was still silent, opaque. He stepped closer. Nothing. He touched the surface. Cold. He whispered, "Who am I to be here?" And with that, a flicker, the fog shifted. For the briefest moment, he saw something. Not his face, but a version of himself standing taller. Eyes brighter, holding a small flame in his hand. He stumbled back. The image vanished. Heart racing, Elias whispered again, "Was that me?" The mirror didn't respond, but somehow it didn't need to. That night, he returned to the village, changed. Not louder, not prouder, just slightly more still. The next day, he did something new. He drew a picture, just a simple drawing of what he saw. It wasn't for anyone, wasn't posted. He folded it, tucked it into his pocket. But that act, recording a glimpse of who he could be, shifted something. Each night, Elias returned to the mirror. Sometimes it stayed blank. Other times, he caught glimpses of himself laughing, building, leading not grand visions, but whole ones, real ones, versions of himself where he belonged. He began to speak more kindly to himself, to pause before apologizing for existing, to smile not for others, but because something inside had begun to stretch, awaken, unfurl. It was slow like the first light of dawn, but it was happening. And the mirror, it showed more, not just him but his possibilities, not fantasies, but futures. The more he trusted, the warmth he saw, the more real it became. People in the village noticed that Elias hadn't changed much on the outside, but something about his presence made rooms feel calmer. His words carried weight, even when soft, and his eyes, they held a quiet fire, too, but the mirror did not react, not immediately. Elias stood in front of it, the silence of the room stretching like a thick curtain. The golden frame, still glowing faintly, offered no sign. The reflection remained as it always had, familiar, timid, fragmented. It wasn't disappointment that Elias felt, was clarity. For the first time, he understood that the mirror wasn't meant to perform tricks. It wasn't magic in the way others had described. It didn't create light from shadows or beauty from absence. What it did was reveal. And revelation, he realized, often took time. He began visiting the mirror daily, not to test it, not to demand a response, but to sit, sometimes with a book, sometimes with a quiet cup of tea, sometimes with nothing but his breath and the echo of the wind curling outside the window. Each visit became an offering, a moment of surrender, of stillness, and slowly his words changed. Not to the world, but to himself. He stopped saying, "I am trying," and began saying, "I am becoming." He stopped asking, "Do they see me?" and began whispering, "I see me." He didn't rush. He didn't force. And on the 17th day, something subtle happened. He looked into the mirror, and for a fleeting second, he didn't recognize the person staring back. It wasn't that his face had changed. It hadn't. But the way it held itself had. There was a gentleness there, a steadiness in his eyes. Still, unwavering presence. He blinked. The image steadied. The mirror, without fanfare, glowed, not with fire, not with spectacle, but with something softer, like sunlight behind a thin curtain, like breath in winter air, like the soul remembering its shape. It showed him not an idealized version of himself, not a hero, not a saint, just him. And for the first time, that felt like enough. He smiled, not because the mirror had worked, but because he had. In the days that followed, Elias kept the mirror uncovered, not as a trophy, not to display its glow, but as a reminder that every belief we feed ourselves, every whisper in the silence, every story we tell in the dark shapes the reflection we meet each morning. Visitors came, as they always had. Some asked about the mirror. Elias would nod, gesture toward it, and say, "It only works when you believe you're enough." Most scoffed. Some nodded politely. A few grew quiet. But one day, a young girl entered the shop. Her eyes were wide, her hands filled with paint stains, her backpack worn and full of sketchbooks. She stared at the mirror for a long time, and then she turned to Elias and said, "Do you think it will work for me?" He paused, not to consider his answer, but to honor her question. Then he said, "It already is, because believing you. Our enough doesn't always roar. Sometimes it enters gently through questions, through art, through silence." Elias never stopped sitting by the mirror, not to seek validation, but to continue a conversation with himself, with time, with truth. And in that quiet room, where the world outside always moved too fast, something beautiful stayed still. And so the mirror stayed, a reflection not of perfection, but of presence, a reminder that the world doesn't change when we shine. It changes when we stop dimming. And if you're listening to this now, if you've carried questions too heavy for the day or doubts too loud for the night, just remember, you are not behind. You are not broken. You are not invisible. You are becoming. And the mirror, the one inside you, has been waiting to glow. Not when you're ready, but when you simply believe. In a quiet village, cradled by whispering hills and winding rivers, there lived a man known only as the woodcutter. His hands were rough, his back bent from years of labor, and his eyes carried the distant light of a man who once dreamed. Every morning, before the sun had fully woken, He walked the same narrow trail into the woods, his axe over one shoulder, his silence over the other. The trees had become his companions, their bark etched with time, just like the lines on his face. The woodcutter never complained, never hurried, never asked for more than what the day allowed. He lived simply, cutting just enough to sell a few logs and cook a warm meal. And yet, on some days, when he sat on a fallen trunk to eat his bread, a strange thought would visit him like a wind from somewhere far away. What if there was more? Not more money, not more fame, but something deeper. A whisper he couldn't name. One morning, as frost still laced the leaves and the sky blushed faintly with morning light, the woodcutter heard something unusual, a voice. It didn't come from any path or animal he recognized. It came from the oldest part of the forest, the part even birds seemed to avoid. "Why do you walk with your head down?" the voice asked, as soft as mist and as old as bark. The woodcutter turned, but saw no one. He waited. Silence. Thinking he imagined it, he resumed his work, striking the tree with rhythm and routine. But the next day, the voice returned. "Do you know what lies beyond the trees you cut?" it asked. He looked again, eyes scanning the gnarled trunks and mossy stones. "Just more trees," he finally answered. The voice chuckled gently, like leaves in wind. "Not if you listen." From that day on, the woodcutter began to notice things he never had before. A hollow tree that echoed differently. A stream that sparkled too brightly on cloudy days. He began to follow these small signs, not out of curiosity, but because something inside him stirred a memory of believing. Days turned into weeks, and each time he ventured further into the woods, the voice grew clearer. It told him stories of a hidden glade where the ground shimmered with gold dust. Not the kind you could touch or sell, but the kind that changed how you saw the world. "Most people never find it," the voice would say, "because they're searching with their hands, not with their heart." The woodcutter didn't understand. Not fully, but he kept going. He stopped bringing his axe. Instead, he carried a small notebook he found buried under a pile of old clothes. It was empty, save for one page where a child's handwriting scribbled, "There's magic in what we do every day." He didn't remember writing it, but he also didn't throw it away. In that notebook, he began to write down the sounds he heard, the dreams he had, the feelings that came and went like the tide. He didn't show anyone. He didn't even tell himself what he was doing. But the voice seemed to grow stronger every time he wrote. "You're waking up," it said one morning, when he had sketched the pattern of bird songs. "You're remembering." Remembering what? He wondered. He was just a woodcutter, a man who had failed to be anything else. He once tried to paint, when he was younger, but the colors never felt right. He once opened a small shop, but no one came. He once loved a woman, but couldn't hold on to her. Now, he just cut trees. That was safe. That was predictable. And yet, here he was, writing in a notebook and chasing the voice of a forest. One day, as winter neared and the trees began to shed their final leaves, the woodcutter found himself at a clearing he didn't recognize. It was perfectly round, almost as if carved by light itself. In the center was a stump, and on that stump a single feather rested. White, with a golden edge. He picked it up, expecting it to vanish or blow away, but it stayed. "This is your beginning," the voice said, "not your ending." Confused, the woodcutter sat on the stump. The wind was still. The woods were silent. And from somewhere deep within himself, he asked aloud, "Why me?" The voice didn't answer this time, not with words. Instead, a feeling washed over him, warmth, like standing in sunlight after days of rain. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel tired. He felt possible. That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed up, writing. He wrote about the feather, the voice, the feeling. The next day, he returned to the village and asked the shopkeeper if he could place a small jar near the door. "For what?" she asked. "4 words," he replied. "For anyone who wants to share a dream." She laughed, but allowed it. Days passed. People ignored it. Then, one morning, someone dropped a note. "I used to dance, but I stopped." The woodcutter read it and wrote back, "Then maybe it's time to start again." More notes came, more replies. The jar filled, and something strange began to happen. People talked, smiled more. Up. One day, a traveler read one of the woodcutter's replies and asked to buy the notebook. "It's not for sale," he said, "but I can copy the pages." The traveler paid him anyway, and others came, asking for stories, for words. 4 pages from the man who once walked alone with his axe and now walked with a voice that had changed. His life, he never stopped going to the woods. But now, he went with purpose, not to cut, but to listen, to remember, to write. And sometimes, just sometimes, he'd find another feather on that same stump. And each time, he'd smile, knowing that some treasures can't be seen by those who are only looking with their eyes. To word of the woodcutter's notes traveled quietly, like rain seeping into the soil, not through announcements or loud declarations, but through the hush of conversations whispered between neighbors, shared over fences, exchanged beneath the breath of morning greetings. And slowly, the village began to change. The bakery started leaving messages of hope inside loaves of bread. The blacksmith hammered quiet verses into the handles of his tools. Even the children, once afraid to wander beyond the path, began to leave drawings in the forest, tucked into tree hollows, or floating gently down the stream. The voice, the one the woodcutter had once thought was just his imagination, never returned in words again. But its presence remained woven into the rustling leaves, folded into the wind's sigh, embedded in the silence between his thoughts. He no longer needed it to speak. It had become part of him. One crisp morning, the woodcutter awoke before the first light touched the hills. He packed nothing. No axe, no notebook, no bread. Just the feather, the one with the golden edge. Had grown slightly dull over time, touched by years and air. But it still carried a weight he couldn't name. He walked beyond the clearing, deeper than he had ever dared. The trees there stood taller, not with pride, but with grace, like guardians of something sacred. As he stepped beneath their watchful boughs, the forest opened, not physically, but emotionally. It welcomed him. And for the first time, he realized that all along, the voice had not been coming from the trees. It had been coming from within. Every hesitation he ever ignored, every tug of intuition, every impossible idea he dismissed, those were the echoes of the voice. The forest had only reflected them back. In the heart of this deeper grove, he found a pool. not of water, but of light. It shimmered without a source, rippling like memory and dream combined. He knelt, holding the feather, and without thinking, let it fall into the pool. Instead of sinking, it hovered just above the surface, spinning slowly. The light around it grew warmer, as if acknowledging the offering. Not visions of the future or ghosts of the past, but moments real, forgotten, buried. The time he stayed up all night, sketching a sunrise he never showed anyone. The day he gave his last coin to a hungry stranger. The laughter of a woman whose name he no longer remembered, but whose eyes had once held him like the sky. All of it returned, not to haunt, but to remind that he had always been more than a man who cut wood. He had been a witness to beauty, a carrier of silent courage, a keeper of unseen things. As the final image faded, the pool stilled. The feather remained, now glowing from within, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. He stood, and without instruction, without map or reason, he began to walk again, but this time not toward the village, not toward any place at all. He simply followed the pull of something greater. Along his path, he met others, not many, but enough. A woman who spoke to stars, a boy who carved stories into stones, an old man who laughed even in the rain. Each of them carried something invisible, just like him. And when they met, they didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They exchanged feathers, symbols, fragments of belief. And then they kept walking. In a far-off town, years later, someone opened a book in a dusty library. It was handwritten, the ink faded, the pages fragile. On the first page, it said, "Collected whispers from the woods." And inside were stories, not just of trees and trails, but of dreams that refused to die, of voices that returned when least expected, of people who learned to believe in the unseen. No author was listed, no credits claimed, but tucked in the back, folded like a secret, was a single feather, white with a golden edge, and beneath it, a note. If you found this, then you're already listening. Somewhere, far beyond roads and maps, the woodcutter, now older, softer, fuller, sat beneath a sky painted in twilight. He no longer asked who he was. He no longer feared what he wasn't. He simply breathed, heart quiet and full, knowing he had not been chosen for greatness, but for grace, and that's enough. The Fisherman and the Golden Pea. We believe there was once a fisherman who lived at the edge of the river, in a small woven hut with a roof of dry grass and walls the color of sand. Every morning, before the sun had stretched its arms across the sky, he would wake, roll his net over one shoulder, and whisper a quiet prayer to the river. He never asked for much, just enough fish to eat, enough to trade, enough to keep his old canoe floating a little longer. His days were simple, quiet, and ordinary. But one morning, as he dragged his net slowly through the shallows, something caught between the tangled ropes. It was not a fish, nor a piece of driftwood. It was a pebble, small, small, and glowing, faintly gold. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but no matter how he turned it in his hands, the shimmer remained. Not bright, not blinding, just soft and warm, like the last light before dusk. He could have sold it. The village had merchants who loved shiny things, travelers who paid well for beauty. But instead, he placed the stone beside the doorway of his home, resting it in a bed of dry leaves and whispering, "You came from the deep. You belong to the earth. Stay with me." Days passed, then weeks. The pebble sat still. Yet something quiet began to shift. A woman passing by on her way to the market noticed the glow. She left a basket of grain by the doorway, saying, "This warmth deserves to be honored." Another day, a child wandered close, drawn by the shimmer, and returned later with a fish as a gift. For the stone, he said simply. The fisherman never asked for anything. Yet his hut, once plain and quiet, began to receive small offerings, seeds, fruits, smiles. No one knew exactly why. They just felt something when they stood near the pebble, like they were remembered, like they were seen. The fisherman continued his daily life, still casting his net, still whispering to the river. But inside, something was blooming. He began to plant the seeds he received. Small gardens took root near the hut. The once barren path became soft with green. Birds began to perch nearby, singing longer than usual. He spoke to them too, softly, not with words meant to be understood, but with a tone the world responds to, gentle, grateful, honest. And the stone continued to glow, not brighter, not louder, but steadier. One night, during a strong storm, many in the village lost their homes, roofs torn, belongings swept. But when they came to the fisherman's hut for shelter, they found warmth and dry space, and the pebble still glowing. He made tea from river herbs, shared every last bit of his grain, and no one left hungry. After the storm passed, the villagers gathered. They looked at the pebble, then at the fisherman, and someone said, "This stone brings fortune." But the fisherman only smiled. "It brings reflection," he whispered. "It reminds us what we already have." Still, the story spread. More people came, some just to sit, others to leave small tokens, not to the man, but to the light. A soft, golden light that never asked for attention, yet gave so much. The fisherman never claimed it as his, never locked it away. He simply lived beside it, and in that quiet companionship, something beautiful grew not just in the soil, but in the hearts of those who passed by. The pebble had come from the river, but its glow was fed by gratitude. And in the fisherman's presence, people remembered that what we honor honors us in return. Too, as seasons changed, so did the rhythm of the village, where once the road near. The river was dry and cracked. Now it bloomed with footsteps and laughter. The fisherman's hut became more than a home. It was a quiet place of arrival. No signs, no invitation, and yet people came. They came when they were weary, when they were lost, when they needed to remember something they couldn't quite name. The golden pebble never spoke, yet it seemed to whisper through the leaves, through the tea, through the stories shared under the tree beside the hut. The fisherman never became rich by the world's standards. He had no coins, no titles, no walls of stone. But what he did have was abundance, the kind that grows slowly, shared in silence and sunlight. A merchant once offered to buy the stone. He arrived in a carriage lined with gold, promising a pouch of rubies and a life without labor. But the fisherman shook his head gently. "How do you buy what cannot be weighed?" he asked. The merchant didn't understand. Most didn't. They only saw the glow, the mystery. But the fisherman had come to understand something deeper, that the pebble was not the source. It was a mirror. It reflected what already lived inside those who paused beside it. And so, he continued to tend his garden, to mend his nets, to sit quietly by the river and watch the water speak in ripples. He told no grand tales, no philosophies. When people asked how the pebble worked, he'd simply say, "Try listening." Some scoffed, some stayed. But those who stayed often left lighter, as if something long buried had been acknowledged. One evening, a young boy arrived. His eyes were wide, his voice quiet. He carried nothing but a broken flute. He had heard the story of the pebble and had walked for days. The fisherman welcomed him with warm tea and silence. The boy sat near, the pebble holding his broken instrument. After a long pause, he whispered, "I don't know what to ask." The fisherman replied, "Then don't. Let it ask you." That night, under a moon softened by mist, the boy slept soundly for the first time in years. The next morning, he fixed his flute with thread and twigs, and when he played, the notes trembled, but they were honest. The pebble glowed softly, and the fisherman smiled. As time passed, the village grew, not in buildings or size, but in spirit. People began planting their own gardens, sharing more, asking less. The glow of the pebble never faded, but it no longer needed to be the center. It had done what it came to do. It had awakened something. One day, the fisherman grew tired, not from illness, but from fullness. He had lived, truly lived. He lay beside the pebble, now worn smooth by time and touch, and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to see." And as his breath slowed, a breeze lifted through the trees, scattering seeds from his garden across the riverbank. Gathered not to mourn, but to remember. They did not build a shrine. They did not frame the pebble in gold. They left it where it had always been, humble, low, glowing. And in its presence, they spoke softer, listened deeper, laughed with more heart. Over time, the fisherman's hut faded back into the earth, but the garden remained, and the pebble, it was still there, still glowing, still reminding anyone who paused that prosperity was never about what you held, but what you honored. The smallest gesture's a seed, a smile, a note on a flute could carry the weight of the sacred, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to chase light, but to be still enough to notice when it visits, to receive it, and quietly to pass it on. Sinan, the guardian of the river tree, they say that every river has a memory, not just of water or stones, but of whispers and waiting. Along the banks of an old valley wrapped in fog, there once flowed a river known not for its size, but for its silence. And beneath that silence, hidden from the eyes of those who no longer believed in wonder, stood an ancient tree rooted deep into the riverbed. No one knew how old the tree was. It never bloomed. It never shed. It simply remained half in water, half in wind. Locals passed by it for years, barely glancing. It was just a tree, after all, until Maeve arrived. Maeve was not from the valley. She came from cities where rivers were lined with pavement and trees were measured in inches of soil between bricks. She was a biologist by training, but by heart. Something softer, something older. She came not with machines, but with a sketchbook. and the habit of sitting still. The elders of the village told her the valley was dying, that the soil no longer held moisture, that the crops refused to speak to the ground, that the river had grown thin, like a tired breath. But Maeve noticed something they didn't. Birds still circled the old river tree. At dawn, deer would pause beneath its limbs and lower their heads not to drink, but as if listening. She felt it too, though she couldn't name it. It was like standing in a chapel built by time, so she made it her ritual. Each morning, she walked down with her notebook and sat beside the tree. She didn't touch it. She didn't measure it. She just watched. One day, after weeks of quiet observation, she saw a thread of golden moss spiraling up the bark. It wasn't there before. Or maybe it had been, hiding from impatient eyes. The next day, she returned with seeds, not special ones, just native shrubs and wildflowers she'd collected along the way. She didn't dig deep. She pressed each one softly into the soil around the roots, like a child tucking in dreams. She watered them with river water and a whisper of hope. Days passed. Then, weeks. The tree began to change, not in a grand way, but in the subtle shift of breath. The air grew warmer near its trunk. Insects returned. The moss grew denser, golden threads curling like ancient scripts. And at night, Maeve began to dream. In her dreams, a woman stood waist deep in the river, hair flowing like algae in current, eyes that held both thunder and lullaby. She said nothing, only looked at Maeve with a gaze that felt like being read. Maeve kept returning, kept planting, kept listening, and soon the tree too began to listen. One morning, Maeve woke to find the tree had bloomed it with flowers, but with droplets of sap glowing amber under the rising sun. The scent was honey and memory. The villagers noticed, first with raised eyebrows, then with questions, then with offerings. One brought a jar of soil from her childhood farm, another feathers from a bird that had returned after years. Maeve said little, but she noticed that with every offering, the tree pulsed, not visibly but inward, like a breath being held and then gently released. News traveled. People began to sit beside the tree, not for spectacle, not for proof, but because something within them longed to be near it, near her. For by now, Maeve knew the tree was not just a tree, and the dreams were not just dreams. Sinan had awakened, not with thunder or floods, but with the quiet loyalty of someone finally being remembered. She was not a goddess to be worshipped. She was a presence to be partnered, a keeper of balance, a mirror of care. And in the mornings, when Maeve stood beside the blooming tree and saw reflections of strangers offering songs and stones and stories, she realized this was not science. This was sacred. And in healing the riverbank, something ancient had healed. In them all, the prosperity that followed wasn't loud. It came in fuller harvests, in cleaner air, in children sleeping deeper, in elders smiling without knowing why. The tree had not changed them. Their attention had. And Sinan, the guardian who waited centuries in stillness, had returned, not with glory, but with grace. All because someone had remembered to kneel. Someone had remembered to care, till the days bled into one another, like the slow flow of the river itself. Aisling awoke each morning with the sound of birds hidden in the willows, her hands already tingling with the urge to touch soil, water, bark. She didn't ask herself why anymore. The rhythm of the work had become prayer. Her boots sank into the marshy riverbank, and she no longer flinched. She planted native reeds and quiet ferns, choosing them with care. The river had changed color since she began. No longer silted and gray, it shimmered with hints of its former clarity, a golden hue dancing when the sun hit just right. Villagers began to notice. First, it was the elders pausing on walks to stare longer at the water. Then, children came closer, building stone towers near the bank again. The whispers started. Soft and unsure was the old spirit returning. Was the river healing? They didn't say Sinan's name aloud. Not yet, but they spoke of a presence. Aisling never asked for help, but help came. A beekeeper left wildflower seeds on her doorstep. A retired teacher offered his shed to store. Her tools? She smiled at these quiet offerings, never demanding, always received with gratitude. Still, she hadn't seen the woman again. The woman from the water. The memory lingered, crisp and surreal. Had it been real? A dream shaped by exhaustion and loneliness. Then, one evening, as the sky flushed with apricot tones and the first stars blinked into existence, Aisling sat near the river, her feet bare, submerged in the cool current. She spoke aloud, not to summon, not to beg, but simply to share. Don't know if you were real, but this feels like enough to heal one place, even a little. The water rippled across the stream where mist gathered low over the surface. A figure stood. She was not luminous, not ethereal this time. She was solid, her feet pressed to the stones. Her hands held a bowl of water drawn from the heart of the river. Her eyes, deep and storm-colored, met Aisling's. You didn't wait for miracles, she said, voice like soft rain. You became one. Aisling's breath caught. The woman crossed the water, not walking on it, but gliding just beneath, as if the river itself carried her weight. She reached the shore and sat beside her. You remembered something that was nearly lost, she continued. Not me, not the stories, but the act, the tending, the belief that something small and repeated is what turns deserts into orchards. She extended the bowl. Aisling took it. The water was warm and shimmered, with faint golden threads. What is this? She asked. Memory, Sinan replied. Of the river, of every hand that ever cared, of every root and leaf that tried again. Aisling drank. It didn't taste like water. It tasted like belonging, like old songs, like the quiet joy of seeing something broken become whole. From that night on, others came. They didn't see Sinan, but they saw change. Flowers bloomed out of season. The sick healed faster. A woman, unable to conceive, bore twins. A man drowning in debt found a new trade by the water. They credited nature, coincidence, hard work, but Aisling knew. She didn't speak of spirits. She only taught others to tend the roots, to speak gently to the land, to give before taking. Prosperity came in waves, never loud, never showy. A steady abundance, like the flow of the river reborn. One day, years later, a child asked Aisling, now gray-haired and wise, if she believed in the old stories. Aisling looked at the river, now wide and alive, its banks a tapestry of green. She smiled. "I don't just believe," she said. "I lived one." And as the child ran off, a breeze stirred the leaves of the great river tree, and a faint laughter, carried by the current, danced into the sky. Sinon was still there, not as a ghost, not as myth, but as something woven into the soil, the water, and the hands of those who remembered to care. On Anansi's web of quiet wisdom, there was once a craftsman named Kojo, who lived in a small village nestled between gentle hills and the sweeping curves of a slow river. He worked with his hands, carving bowls, weaving baskets, and shaping wooden toys for children he rarely saw smile. His shop was modest, just a dusty shelf, an old wooden table, and the steady beat of his hammer. Each morning he opened his shutters before sunrise, not to greet customers, he had few but to greet possibility. He believed in craftsmanship, in the quiet beauty of skill, but he did not yet believe in himself. One evening, as the air cooled and insects sang their last lullabies, Kojo sat at his loom, weaving a simple pattern. The colors were his own, dyed from roots and berries, earth-toned and honest. Then he felt it, a faint vibration in the air, like a chord tuned to stillness. He looked down, and frozen the loom sat a small spider, slender and calm, its legs moving as if pressing invisible threads into the weave. It paused, looked at him, and turned back to its work. Kojo's breath caught. He could not move. The spider's thread was not silk but light, not colored but feeling. And in that instant, he understood that he was no longer alone. The spider wove. Each day, at the same hour, it appeared. He dared not shoo it away. Instead, he learned to leave a small bowl of honey and a drop of water beside the loom. They were gifts. It did not speak. But after weeks, Kojo began to notice patterns. A loop here that carried patience, a knot there that taught restraint, a line that curved with humor. He couldn't explain it, but his hands knew. One morning, a merchant came by. He noticed a basket in the window. It glowed with extra care. He offered Kojo a price he'd never dreamt. But Kojo hesitated. His heart whispered that something more important than money had entered his shop. He said no. The merchant left confused. That night, the spider wove a new shape, a spiral that hummed with resilience. Kojo watched until the pattern closed. Then he whispered to the web, "Help me share." The web shimmered in response. Over the next days, Kojo began teaching not with words, but with woven pieces. He invited a child to weave a single thread. The child laughed when it tangled, but the web shimmered, and the child learned to untangle gently. A young woman came to learn patience. The web glowed when her hands slowed. The village elder showed up seeking humor. The web wove secret jokes in the pattern, and the elder smiled without knowing why. Quiet prosperity began to flow into the community. Not gold, not fame, but something deeper, a feeling of being seen, of learning together, of hands that did not tremble anymore at new skills. Kojo's shop became a place of small miracles. Travelers came, drawn not by advertising, but by stories: a silent loom, a spider's gift, a craftsman who taught without words. Soon, Kojo realized that the spider was no ordinary creature. It was Anansi the spider, who in ancient lore rescued wisdom for those who didn't need to hold it too tightly. Only Kojo didn't need to trade the web. He had found it at home, but the world needed it too. One morning, Anansi wove its final lesson into a web, a circle of threads connecting every knot Kojo had learned. It glowed so brightly, so quietly, that even the sun paused. Kojo stood and spoke softly. "Thank you." Anansi's thread unraveled into the air and drifted away. The spider left with it, and Kojo realized that he now carried the web within himself. He no longer needed Anansi weaving. Beside him, his hands remembered. The patterns remained, and the village remembered too. Kojo no longer expected the spider's return, but every morning he still left a drop of honey and a thread of silence near the loom. Not out of habit, but reverence. He understood now that the web had never belonged to the spider alone. It had always belonged to anyone willing to listen slowly, move carefully, and offer their hands without rush. With each sunrise, more villagers gathered not just to learn weaving, but to sit in the hush that surrounded the loom. It became a place where people spoke in fewer words and listened with more space between thoughts. There were no instructions, only demonstrations, and even those were quiet. Kojo began crafting what he called silent pieces, woven symbols that held stories within them. 1. Not for loss. 2. For growth. 3. For the kind of laughter that arrives after pain. A young mother came in one evening carrying grief like a hidden sack. Kojo handed her a woven square, light brown with threads of silver. She held it and wept not because of what was said, but because of what was understood without needing to be. Word of the loom spread beyond the village, not like fire, but like warmth. People from faraway towns came not looking for products, but for peace. Each visitor would bring something: a leaf, a feather, a strand of hair, a tiny stone. Kojo would gently place these into the fabric. Slowly, the loom became more than a tool. It became a witness. Every fiber carried pieces of dozens of lives. Yet, no peace shouted. All whispered, and that was enough. Children who once feared mistakes now embraced them. Kojo taught them to pause whenever the thread tangled. That knot, he'd say, with a smile that barely moved, is part of the pattern too. He taught a fisherman to see weaving in the way he cast his net. He taught a baker to understand patience in how dough rises. He taught a widow to recognize love in how her thread always curved toward others. The spider's presence faded into memory, but its wisdom deepened in the quiet. One day, the village square grew crowded, not because of any festival, but because people simply wanted to sit near the loom. Kojo didn't speak that day. He just wove a giant spiral, one thread, then another. People watched as the pattern expanded, then contracted into a perfect circle. And at the center of it all, he wove one single knot, made from a strand he had kept for years, the last thread Anansi had ever left. When it was done, the village elders stood and whispered, "This is not just a web, it is memory." The people nodded. The loom stood still, and then something strange happened. A soft breeze entered the room. The windows trembled. The threads glowed just faintly in. Those closest to the loom felt a shiver, not of cold, but recognition, as if something unseen had smiled. Kojo turned to the crowd and bowed not low, but deep enough to offer honor. "Wisdom," he finally said aloud, after years of silence. was never meant to be hoarded, only held lightly so it can pass. He then gave the loom away. Piece by piece, he disassembled it and handed parts to different villagers. A leg to the young teacher, a beam to the baker, a spindle to the widow. Build your own, he said, and let it teach you. He walked away that evening with empty hands and a heart so full it almost glowed in his chest. As he left the village, someone whispered, "Where is he going?" But no one answered. They didn't need to. Kojo had taught them what Anenzi had taught him. Sometimes the thread that changes everything is invisible. Sometimes the quietest patterns shape the loudest destinies. And sometimes prosperity begins not in the marketplace, but in the hush, between two breaths, when a hand meets another, and both agree to weave without hurry, without fear, and without needing applause. The legacy of Anansi lived on not in legends or loud stories, but in every silent thread passed between hands that believe wisdom can still be made, one knot at a time.